Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's October 11th, 2025. I'll be soloing it today. Gold hit $4,000 this week. 4,000 US dollars for the first time in the metal's history, and it was not long ago that, less than a year ago in fact, that gold crossed the $3,000 mark. A generation ago, at the turn of the millennium, gold was at $300 an ounce. Why then has a metal that doesn't do much? It's not quite accurate to say that gold doesn't have any non-monetary utility. It's used in electronics, satellites, and some other industrial uses, but 90+% of the valuation is monetary in nature. If it doesn't throw off any returns, if gold doesn't do anything but just sit there, why is gold $4,000 an ounce now when it was just $300 an ounce 25 years ago? That is a return of about 1,500% over a 25-year period, which works out to an annualized inflation rate, if gold is really an accurate measure of inflation, of 11% annualized. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is the most well-known and most regularly cited measure of official consumer price inflation, by contrast, is up over that same period of time, the period of time that gold went from $300 to $4,000 an ounce, for an annualized inflation rate measured by gold of 11% per year. The CPI over the same period of time is up just 100% over 25 years, which works out to an annualized rate of less than 3% annually, 2.8 to be precise. And so when the criticism is leveled at the CPI as a risible, putative measure of an increase in consumer prices, this is why, even if people can't articulate exactly how the CPI is incorrect, it clearly is off the mark, unless the argument is going to be made that somehow gold has become 4 times more valuable over the last 25 years relative to other consumer products than it had been 25 years ago. That beggars belief. There is no way to make a serious argument to say that the technological progress that's taken place over that period of time, this is the era of smartphones and supercomputing, the onset of artificial intelligence, electric cars, the explosion of China onto the world stage as a resource gathering and manufacturing powerhouse. To say that over this period of time when all these things are happening, the subjective valuation of a metal that doesn't do much of anything has become more desirable at a rate 4 times that of the increased desirability of consumer products, it just doesn't make any sense at all on its face. What it does indicate is that there is something very, very wrong. There is a deep rot at the heart of the dollar as the global reserve currency and the fiat system that underpins it. And the rapid increase in the valuation of gold, an increase in the valuation as it's denominated in dollars, it should be pointed out, because the inverse of that, of course, is not that gold is becoming more valuable. That's the point I'm trying to underscore here. That seems clear that simply is not the case, that gold has become more valuable in a way that makes sense in terms of human utility or subjective preference. But instead, what that is showing is that the real purchasing power of the dollar, other fiat currencies as well, but particularly the dollar, is on the decline. And that portends particularly poorly for the American material standard of living in the future, because the United States runs a $100 billion, give or take, monthly goods deficit. That is every day about $3 billion, with a B, $3 billion more of physical goods come into the United States than go out of the United States. The cargo ships come in, loaded up from Asia, and they return over the Pacific largely empty. And at first blush, that seems great. America conjures up dollars and sends those dollars abroad, and in return, America gets cargo ships full of consumer goods to the tune of $3 or $4 billion a day worth of stuff that comes in beyond what goes out. The problem, of course, is if those containers stop coming in full of stuff, well, now Americans have to go with $3 billion a day worth of stuff less than Americans were accustomed to enjoying. Some of that shortfall can be made up domestically at higher prices, but most of it cannot be, especially over the short to medium term. There's a lot of capital investment required for the manufacturing processes that have as their final products those container cargo ships full of goods produced in Asia. When the U.S. went off the gold standard, the so-called Bretton Woods system in 1971, gold at the time was under $40 an ounce. And then by 2000, a generation later, it had gone up to $300 an ounce, an increase comparable to, although actually slightly less than the increase we've seen since 2000 up to the present of 2025. And that was effectively an American currency default. We call U.S. Federal Reserve notes dollars as shorthand, but a dollar had a distinct, explicit definition in gold, as measured in gold at the birth of the United States as a sovereign country. In 1792, 1.5 grams of gold was worth $1, and that is what a dollar meant. It was not until the 1930s that, in violation of constitutional rules about what constitutes money, which is silver and gold only, that gold was outlawed domestically under the FDR administration, with the threat of confiscation hanging over the heads of the entire American population. But the gold valuation of the dollar continued to hold internationally, and other countries were permitted to exchange their Federal Reserve notes, what we now in the vernacular refer to as dollars, those green pieces of paper with the faces of founding fathers on them. That continued for another 40 odd years until it couldn't continue anymore, because there was no conceivable way for America's material standard of living to be maintained while continuing to make good on the gold to U.S. Federal Reserve note exchange rate being honored. And so in 1971, the Nixon administration ended the Bretton Woods system and dispensed with what remained of the gold standard entirely. The decade of the 70s infamously was a decade of massive consumer price inflation and dollar purchasing power devaluation. And I think we are on the cusp of another iteration of that several year period of significant, substantial, and unrelenting increases in consumer prices. Increases that will reveal the spike in consumer prices that have characterized the United States over the last 4 or 5 years look like just an appetizer for the main course that is coming. The dollar's value is underpinned by American military might and by American global hegemony. And you don't need me to tell you that both of those things are under a serious strain. The American military seems incapable of winning anything, anywhere, after spending 2 decades in Central Asia and Afghanistan. The American empire withdrew, and the place looks little changed from where it was before the United States made its entry. America sent hundreds of billions of dollars in military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine, and the end result 2 years later is an impending Russian victory and something way down the road towards an entire state collapse of the country of Ukraine. In the Middle East, with American resources and military equipment, Israel looks set to be throwing in the towel against its military incursion into ethnic cleansing of and occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the Palestinian territories. The record is a dismal one. There are no clear-cut instances of American military dominance being displayed anywhere since the turn of the century. And the international opposition to the American empire is growing in boldness and intensity. The Henry Kissinger admonition to, at whatever cost, avoid pushing China and Russia into an alliance against America has been spectacularly ignored. Turkey, which 20 years ago was clamoring to join the European Union and be welcomed into the Western international alliance, now has major political figures campaigning on moving away from Europe and the United States and towards Russia and China. And so it's time to buckle up for some very rough riding economically over the coming years and decades. No FINRA certification here, so the tiresome caveats about this not being official financial advice. Applying my amateur recommendation is to get a hold of some gold. Central banks around the world are doing it because I think they are privy to some information that the public doesn't have as clear an insider access to. From that depressing, if dry topic, to one that is more depressing and far more angering at a visceral level. Ron Exantis, the name of a man who broke into a Kentucky family's home and stabbed a 6-year-old boy to death and stabbed several of his siblings and his father, has been released after just 7 years of incarceration. The case is open and shut in terms of the forensics. Exantis was the killer, used a knife in the bedroom. There are no additional clues needed. There is no question here at all. He was at the scene of the crime. He admitted to it. The bloody weapon was there when the police arrived, and the police were only able to detain and arrest Exantis because the slain boy's father, Dean Tipton, subdued Exantis. He put him in a chokehold and kept him restrained until police arrived. Accounts are Dean Tipton's life and the life of his entire family was shattered, as would be expected. This killing occurred in 2015. Upon news of Exantis' release, Dean Tipton, the father, said, quote, "I've had my talks with God because I'm not afraid to tell, and I've told the court if I ever cross paths with him, I will kill the man. I will kill him where he stands," unquote. And man, this story is just a horrible, horrible metaphor for modern America. Dean Tipton is a wholesome white prole who had the most precious thing in existence sacrificed to what effectively is a feral bioweapon that is deployed by the existing power structure to terrorize middle America. Exantis, who, in case you hadn't guessed it, is black, was given 7 years in prison for murdering a 6-year-old child in cold blood. And there are discivilizational, psychopathic monsters like him in every major urban area in the country and in a lot of places in between that are coddled and protected and apologized for by a system that does not want to stop them, that sees their actions as long as the managers of that system are able to seclude themselves from the problems that those bioweapons cause, that does not want at all to stop them, but instead sees their actions as a feature rather than a bug. Because there is nothing the managerial class hates more than a family like the Tiptons. The Tipton mother is a nurse. The father, Dean, works a third shift, blue-collar job. He has an Appalachian accent. He's from flyover country. Xanthus allegedly targeted the house because there were Christmas lights on that made it easier to see his way to the front door. These are working class, married, prolish, Appalachian, white Christians in the American heartland. And so from the perspective of the managerial elite, the Tiptons had it coming to them. They are the worst of the worst. If you think that characterization is hyperbolic, ask yourself, honestly, if Dean Tipton makes good on his threat and cuts short the life of Ron Xanthus in the same way that Ron Xanthus cut short the life of Dean's 6-year-old son, Logan, do you think that Dean would end up spending less than 7 years in prison or more than 7 years in prison if he wasn't executed before then? It's a rhetorical question because the answer is obvious to anyone who is honest with himself. They tried to put Kyle Rittenhouse away forever. They tried to put Daniel Penny away forever. They've put Derek Chauvin away forever. They'll lock Heritage American men away for a lot less and throw away the key. So keep this reality in mind. I'm speaking to conservative-minded, traditionalist, Heritage Americans here. This system is not a moral system. You do not owe it anything on a moral or spiritual level. There are pragmatic calculations to be made, transactional considerations to work through, but morally, you don't owe this system anything. Think, 2,000 years ago, for Christians, the Roman Empire was much more just than the current year American justice system. Pontius Pilate could be reasoned with. Pontius Pilate was the reasonable one. He undertook an extensive investigation and found no wrongdoing, tried to release Jesus, and then ultimately washed his hands of the whole sordid affair when he was overwhelmed by the public braying for blood. The American legal system, in contrast, is nowhere close to as willing to advocate on behalf of innocent and often persecuted and prosecuted Heritage Americans. From gruesome to gruesome we go. The Charlie Kirk murder is, well, as Vox Day is fond of saying, well, we don't necessarily know what is true. We can reliably assert that the official story is incorrect because the official story is always incorrect. Until 2 weeks ago, I'd not ever listened to a Candace Owens podcast, but over the last 2 weeks, I've listened to every single one, and to the extent that there is any weight that can be put into my vouching for the veracity of the concerns and questions that she brings up in underscoring just how apt Vox Day's assertion is with regards to this case, I tell you that the lone shooter narrative is not the correct one. That is not what happened. I won't try to rehash all of the holes in the official story here. If you're so inclined to dive into the details, I can recommend nothing better than the last couple of weeks of the Candace Owens podcast. The question I want to bring to bear is the public nature of the execution. The conclusion that Candace Owens seems to be groping towards is that this was, if not an explicit state operation, then at least a state-sponsored and state-approved hit job, with that state being Israel. After all, less than a year ago, the Israeli state, the Netanyahu Likud administration, was publicly celebrating the exploding pager situation in Syria that killed hundreds of suspected, or at least claimed to be, Hezbollah members, with untold amount of collateral damage having occurred. And these putative Hezbollah agents at the time of the exploding pagers would have been in grocery stores and praying at mosques and out walking public streets when they detonated. The devices they were holding or had in their pockets detonated and killed some of them with shrapnel and killed and injured other innocent members of the public who happened to be in close proximity with them at the time. And so if they do that and they celebrate that, would they not conceivably take out a hit on an influential member of their American sugar daddy if it was perceived to be in their benefit to do so? And moral considerations aside, from an Israel first perspective, could certainly make sense to do so, particularly if Charlie Kirk, who had a well-earned reputation for being a stout defender of Israel, if he was changing his perspective privately, but only just beginning to broach the subject publicly, well, what better time to dispatch him and turn him into a martyr for the cause that he was in the initial stages of walking away from. And the Israeli government, in fact, Netanyahu himself and their proxies in the West, vociferously denying having anything to do with the assassination, brings to mind the Shakespearean line from Hamlet, quote, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks," unquote. But if it was Israel, or it was done with the blessing of the Israeli government, and that is, of course, speculation, just conjecture, potential conjecture on the cui bono question of who benefits from what has happened, as a possible suspect, a plausible suspect anyway, but certainly not one that there is any hard evidence that I'm able to point to that shows that definitively Israel did it or had an active hand in it, but instead just thinking through the possibilities of who could have done it, again on account of the fact that what certainly did not happen is the official story as reported by the corporate media and the FBI, with these ridiculous manufactured Shakespearean alleged text exchanges between Robinson, the solo shooter who conveniently allegedly confessed to the crime over text and did so in a way as to not implicate anyone else. That story is certainly not true. It is natural that curious observers are going to wonder what the real story was. And in that vein, some aspects of the killing that argue against Israeli involvement, most notably how public and as graphic as an assassination could possibly be, quite possibly the most graphic and widely viewed killing in the history of humanity. Why, if the purpose is to use Kirk's legacy and the momentum of Turning Point USA to bolster American governmental support for the Israeli project in the Middle East, why do it so publicly in an open-air college campus with countless cell phone video footage being recorded and uploaded to the cloud for internet sleuths across the entire globe to comb through to find inconsistencies with and holes in the official story as reported. Why not go the route that they did with the InfoWars reporter who was killed earlier this year in Austin, Texas, or Jeffrey Epstein, or Seth Rich, the Democratic Party operative who knew too much about what the party was doing to throw the selection process to Hillary Clinton and steal it from Bernie Sanders, who was killed in the street, or the OpenAI whistleblower Sujir Balaji, who was found brutally killed, cited somehow. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but there was blood in multiple rooms and signs of a struggle, and part of a wig found in the apartment, and the family disputes that it was a suicide and instead maintains that it was a homicide. Why not, if the determination was made that Charlie Kirk needed to be taken out, why not take him out in one of these ways? With geo-tracking and what the alphabet intelligence agencies have access to, the NSA and Mossad, if that were one of the entities involved, that finding a way to execute a private hit on Charlie Kirk would have been presumably at least as logistically easy as the operation that took place last month was. And so why go through all of that and create all of this fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the assassination in a way that reflects poorly on Israel and on the American intelligence agency and the deep state? Why go through all that? The first retort that probably comes to mind is, well, it's to send a chilling message out to anyone else who would dare question America's support for Israel and the blending of the MAGA movement into what it is becoming under the second Trump administration. But the obvious problem with that is they're publicly denying it and calling those who raise questions about it, who are, quote, just asking questions, unquote, as kooks and bigots and anti-Semites and members of the woke right and all of these other derisive, derogatory names. And so it doesn't seem that this would be sending a chilling message. Who's going to receive the message that you don't stand up to Israel? Because if you do, this happens to you. Well, if that was the message that you wanted to be sent, then you would presumably, at the very least, lend a lot of credence to the conclusion that this was another Hezbollah pager type situation. And in that case, Israel did in fact celebrate that thing happening, but they're not doing so here. It feels like to maintain that line of thought requires us going into some double back shot 4D chess assessment where people in the know while the masses don't know. And so the idea would be that the public thinks that the lone gunman, transgender shooter, that story is the real one, while the people who are intrigued by the arguments being put forth by Candace Owens and others who are taking a line similar to hers, that those people will get the message that you don't mess with Israel, because if you do, you'll get taken out. But the public will be blithely unaware of those putatively cryptic messages being sent. If that's the calculation, then it seems one that is fatally flawed and riddled with poor miscalculations, because so-called revisionist or questioning ex-posts about the Kirk killing get millions of impressions and lots of sharing and engaging with. It is not something that only the absolutely most politically engaged are aware of. The awareness has spread way beyond just those potential opinion makers who would be the only ones who would be intended to take the message that it was Mossad or it was Israel or it was the American empire or one of the alphabet agencies within the empire, that it was in some capacity an action of the American empire, of the managerial state, and that if they'll take out Charlie Kirk, they sure as heck won't lose any sleep taking out you. If only the people that is applicable to were intended to receive the message. Well, it's gotten way, way, way beyond that and has caused far more reputational damage and further eroded trust that was already shaky and becoming shakier by the day in said ruling power structure. It has been far more of a cost to those interests than the price should have justified. Pivoting now to a subject of interest to people in the demographic of the putative single solo shooter Tyler Robinson in the Charlie Kirk case, and also apropos of the first subject we opened with about the decline in the material standard of living for Americans, that is the question of home ownership and how it is increasingly becoming part of an American past that is fading from view, and a future that in many ways will resemble less and less that past. So enough of the strained and bumbled transition there. From the Economist YouGov, from a poll released this week, the percentages of Americans who own their own homes by age cohort. Among Zoomers, those under the age of 30, just 29% do. Among millennials, it's 50%, Xers, 59%, and among boomers, it's 73%. And by own in this context, we mean people who have a mortgage for a residential property. Far fewer of the people in each of these age cohorts will own their homes outright. This is just being on at least the first couple of steps towards true home ownership. And fewer than 3 in 10 Zoomers are moving in that direction, and only half of millennials are. And that is because more than half of young American adults, this is from the U.S. Census Bureau as of 2020, among Americans between the ages of 18 and 34, 52%, so more than half, live still with their parents. That contrasts dramatically from what the stats were in 1960. So 65 years ago now, only 10% of Americans in the same age bracket from 18 to 34 live with their parents. And in a vacuum, I think there are some potential salutary effects from families spanning multiple generations living under the same roof. But in the American context in particular, one major consequence of this change, or maybe something that is happening contemporaneously with the change, driven by some of the same factors that are causing people to live with their parents and into middle age and beyond, is the retardation of family formation. Young Americans don't have the means, financial and otherwise, to cut the umbilical cord and get out there on their own. And so they don't find life partners as easily or as frequently. They don't shack up. They don't get married, have kids, and the fertility rate falls off a cliff. This has hardly been an episode replete with good news. This, if what we opened with, if there is truth in that presaging of an incoming significant reduction in the material standard of living of Americans, well, as concerning as these numbers are, they are set only to get worse than this. And this is a social problem, a novel one for humanity, to be experiencing a continued and seemingly inexorable decline in family formation and fertility, absent a devastating external event like the plague in Europe in the Middle Ages, or World War II and the deprivations and destruction that it brought. And of course, in the case of World War II, and also in the case of the plague, after the external threats receded, they were succeeded by massive upticks in the fertility rate and family formation. That's where the baby boomers get their sobriquet. They were the consequence of a return to normalcy from an aberrational period that had depressed birth rates temporarily. And they and their siblings represented a bouncing back and making up for the missed fertility and then some. But it's hard to see any obvious parallel with the depressed and continually falling fertility and family formation rates we're experiencing in the West today. To the dwindling number of prospective parents out there, some onomastic advice, that is, advice relating to the naming of children. If you are having a boy, then give that boy a biblical male name, because short of that, there is little that can be done to guard against your son's name having transitioned to becoming a name for girls, for women, by the time he reaches his golden years. There is a distinct tendency for male names to become female given names over time. There is, so far as I'm aware and so far as I've been able to research, not a single example of the reverse of a name that had initially been a girl's name that became a boy's name over time. The closest you can get is the nickname Pat, but that can refer to Patricia as easily as it can to Patrick. In the case of just Pat as a shorthand nickname, that has become more male over time. But that is the only example I am aware of, and humorously enough, that was the name given to the androgynous Saturday Night Live character from the 90s, a bit that they couldn't possibly do today, or wouldn't possibly have the cojones to do today, but the bit was one that generated humor over a character named Pat being perceived as a man or being perceived as a woman when it wasn't clear what he or she was.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Have a nice weekend.
You too. After you, sir. Or ma'am.
Thank you.
A lot of people say, what's that? It's Pat. A lot of people ask, who's he or she? A ma'am or sir, accept him or her, for whatever it might be. It's time for androgyny. Here comes Pat.
So given the single qualified instance of the reverse from the rule of names initially starting as men's names and becoming women's names, well, what are some of those examples? We'll go through a few of them, by no means an exhaustive list, but enough of a list to drive the point home. And if it's not something that you've thought about before, I think you'll be surprised when you realize just how many instances of this pattern there are. Kennedy, that was a century ago exclusively a male name, and now it is exclusively a given female name. Lindsay, again, century ago, exclusively a male name. Now it is exclusively a female name. And yes, I am aware that there is a senator from South Carolina with the name Lindsey Graham. The point that it is now an exclusively female name still stands. Sydney, that's another exclusively male name that is now an exclusively female name. Ashley was exclusively a male name. In the case of going back to Sydney, you think of Sydney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, and Ashley Montague, for example. That was a man, and now it is a name that is exclusively female. Some names that were exclusively male in the past that have not become exclusively female but are moving in that direction. A name, Taylor. Shannon is another one that was exclusively a male name a century ago and now is overwhelmingly a female name. Skylar was exclusively a male name to begin with and now is a majority female name. Riley, exclusively male, now majority female. Reagan, another one that was overwhelmingly a male given name 100 years ago and is now overwhelmingly a female name. Peyton, thinking of Peyton Manning fame, that was historically a male name that is now overwhelmingly a female name. Bailey is another name, exclusively male until the 1980s when it became overwhelmingly female and remains overwhelmingly female today. There are other names that are in the process of switching over that haven't completely done so yet, but are on their way to doing so. Names like Dakota, Jordan, Alex, Casey, and a couple more that I missed previously. Morgan, exclusively a male name that has now become overwhelmingly a female name. Kendall is another one that 100 years ago was exclusively male and is now overwhelmingly, by more than 10 to 1, a female name. You'll note that none of these examples are biblically given names of men. Being mentioned in Scripture is protection against a name transitioning from being male to female. So if you have a boy and you want him to remain a boy, or want naming way always to think of him as a boy, well, turning to the good book is a good place to start. Relatedly, one of the things you realize as you settle into middle age is that naming conventions, like so much else in life, is cyclical. Because of the confounding factor of male names becoming female over time, I'll focus on female names here exclusively to help make the point clear, because female names remain female. Once they become female, they stay reliably female into the indefinite future. But just because their sex association becomes clear over time, it doesn't mean that the popularity stays consistent over time. What tends to happen is names become popular for a period of time, and then as the large cohort of people with that given name get older, it becomes less trendy for young mothers to give names of their older sisters to their own kids, or give names to their children that they associate with old maids. I experience that now with names like Stella and Charlotte and Vivian and Evelyn, names that when I was a kid were the names that the blue-haired residents at my grandmother's retirement home had. But now in America, those are the 46th, 4th, 8th, and 77th, respectively, most common given names to newborns in 2025. I'll end on that pensive note. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.